thank you everybody for joining us. The first thing I should say is this event is being live interpreted by Jan and Guilherme. Thank you very much to them. You should be able to see a globe where you can choose a language between English and Portuguese at the bottom of your screen. And then you will just hear the translation, or if people are speaking in English, they will speak in English. Or if they're speaking in Portuguese and you choose the Portuguese line, you will only hear in one language. Hopefully that will work. Se você escolher a linguagem no globo, pode escolher o português. So, firstly, I'd just like to thank the panelists all for joining me, and Jolanta and the IHSS for helping arrange this event, and Sophia, who's going to help coordinate the Q&A. This project for me emerged not with Milton Santos, but with somebody else, with Josué de Castro, another Brazilian geographer. And I started writing a PhD about Josué de Castro and the history of Josué de Castro's ideas, and I was working in his archive in Recife, looking at the development of his kind of very early version, a kind of precursor of critical geography, in particular his geography of hunger. And it was through Josué de Castro that I got to Milton Santos, not least because any reading of the history of Brazilian geography takes you very quickly through Milton Santos. You can't understand or read the history of 20th century Brazilian geography without Milton Santos. So I kind of came upon Milton partly as a kind of successor of Josué de Castro. And Milton Santos knew and admired Josué de Castro greatly. He said in 1998, "Acho que Josué foi gênio." I think old Josué was a genius. And this has been a kind of, I found this an inspiring sort of interconnection in their relationship as a way of thinking about the kind of backdrop to contemporary critical Brazilian geography through Josué de Castro as kind of a precursor to Milton Santos. But it brought me to Milton Santos in a different way as well, which was the working on Josué de Castro made me realize the absolute centrality of translation as a problem and as a dynamic in thinking about a kind of anti-colonial geography, in thinking about how to unwrite and reimagine the kind of categories of space and nature that geographical thinking in the Anglophone world and the global North operated with. And to do that, thinking through translation emerged to me as an absolutely central problematic. So I wrote about translation quite a lot in thinking about the legacy and impact and ideas of Josué de Castro. But I became kind of frustrated with only writing about translation and became interested in the practice of translation as a way of thinking geographically itself. So I having kind of finished or at least made a lot of progress on my work on Josué de Castro, I came to Milton Santos and I decided not to kind of try and do a similar piece of work on the history of Milton Santos through archival or intellectual history kind of work, but instead to engage directly as a translator. And so I, in 2019, spent most of the year very slowly, very slowly and painstakingly translating this wonderful book. And that led me to a particular kind of knowledge of Milton Santos, a very intimate and personal and very parochial kind of knowledge of Milton Santos, which is deep inside his references, his cadence, his poetics. And that kind of was a fascinating and very profound process for me, and has led to other translation projects, including a project working with, partly with Alex Katz, who is here, on the Brazilian feminist, Black feminist scholar, Beatriz Nascimento, of whom Alex is the preeminent scholar. So I've kind of developed a translation practice out of this work on Milton. Having finished that project, I then came to a very personal knowledge of Milton Santos. But it's been since finishing the book that I've kind of developed a different kind of understanding of Milton Santos, and in particular, a much more peopled, a kind of populated understanding of his work. And I mean that in two ways in particular. Firstly, through reading his Milton Santos's writing, his way of thinking, I think, is a profoundly social way of developing critical thought. He lives with the people he reads very closely, very intimately, and he's in this very sustained kind of dialogue, I think, with his references and with the intellectual worlds in which he inserts himself. And I came to kind of understand that in having finished the project, I think. But secondly, a more peopled understanding through, in particular, this project of organizing a set of reviews of the translation organized by Dialogues in Human Geography. And that process has been a really wonderful one for me, of kind of going outside of this very detailed relationship with Milton Santos into a much more peopled understanding of how his work is being read today and the work that has been done on Milton Santos in the last 50 years, ever since he was started to be received in the world of geography. So that's kind of all I want to say, apart from now to introduce these people who I'm now kind of feel in dialogue with about Milton Santos's work. And they are, and we will then go in this order. Mariana Lamego, who is just trying to remember everybody's institutions, it's frightfully important, works at the Universidade do Estado do Rio de Janeiro. And she's written kind of widely, and I've known Mariana as a scholar of the history of Brazilian geography, in particular Brazilian quantitative geography, but much more broadly than that as well. And then we will turn to Alex Hatz, who, as I mentioned, is a superb scholar of the history of Black feminism and Black feminist thought in Brazil, and works at the University of Goias in the northeast of Brazil. He's written extensively on the history of Black thought in Brazil. He's also a wonderful poet and writer as well. And then we will turn to Kanishka Goonewardena, who works at the University of Toronto, and his research kind of includes a wide range, an extremely impressive range of approaches to the histories of urban planning and architecture, but also Marxist philosophy and the role of Marxist philosophy in geographical thinking, very broadly construed. And then I hope we will be joined by Professor Rafael Sanzio dos Anjos, who I think may be having some technical difficulties joining us, but hopefully he will, and he will jump into the conversation. He's one of Brazil's leading scholars of Afro-Brazilian space and professor at the University of Brasília, and also visiting professor at the University of Bahia, and director of the Center of Applied Cartography and Geographical Information at the University of Brasília, and I hope he will also join us. And finally, Michelle Buckley, who it's been a pleasure to work with on the review, the forum of reviews that Dialogues kind of commissioned on this book. And she also works at the University of Toronto and working kind of across real estate work, employment, labor migration, and is also one of the editors of Dialogues on Human Geography. Maita Conde, who was also due to join us, is unfortunately not able to join us today. But I think there are plenty of voices for us to engage with. So I will, with that, hand over to Mariana. Each presenter will speak for sort of 5 to 7 minutes, and then I will invite them to respond to one another before turning to our attendees and to an open Q&A. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mariana.
Thank you very much, Archie. It's so nice to be here today, and so nice to meet Michelle as well. It was so important to have her reviews and the texts on the Dialogues Forum. I'm here with him. I bring the book with me. It's a wonderful piece that I have for about like 20 or something years with me, and it's full of marks and rights. So thank you again to be here. It will be delightful to have this conversation. I also need to thank the effort to make this event a multilingual one. We should always celebrate these initiatives showing that multilingualism is viable, it's a viable alternative to scientific and academic communication beyond the monolingualism that we are just used to. But I will present my talk here in Portuguese. Bom, para contribuir nessa discussão de hoje.
To contribute today, I'd like to look at three different aspects which are involved in the to do with the article that was published in Forum Dialogues in Human Geography, talking about Archie's translation here for a new geography. So the first aspect that I wanted to highlight, it's not just a book about geography's history, it's also part of geography's history. And it's one of many books that were written at the end of the 70s, the beginning of the 80s in Brazil, that proposed new narratives, interdisciplinary elements as well. And it was also the emergence of critical geography in Brazil. And so differently to other texts like Andrade, Milton Santos, and other authors, it was written by a geographer who was in exile. So this unique experience meant that he had lots of experiences outside of Brazil, being a Black Brazilian. And this impacts all his and influences all his writing. He recognizes that there's a crisis in his discipline's identity, which had no precedent. And he sent that the practice of geography had been impoverished, and especially by the inequality that exists between the countries. And it felt that Brazil was isolated from debates about human society, especially when it comes to the space. So in the introduction to the book, he talks about he wants to come to a critical geography and use instruments to look at the object. And its reception was also very unique. He came back to Brazil just before in '77, and the first publication of his happened in the famous Congress of the Brazilian Geographers Association in '78.
For a New Geography was received that year as a light at the end of the tunnel by a new generation that was engaged in critical engagement in relation to the geography of the status quo. Saga of Milton Santos' return to Brazil is counted and recounted, retold and retold, showing the transformations of the book that happened in the change of Brazilian geography from the 80s onward. The second aspect that I want to highlight here is that carries the responsibility of setting the tone of the critique of quantitative geography and its impact on Brazilian geography. Santos, in his text, in the chapter regarding this kind of geography, is accused of setback. Milton Santos' position contrasts widely with a shared understanding in Anglo-American geography of some of the legacies of quantitative geography, such as the constant concern regarding methodology, space, and movement, issues which geographer Tim Grosso will talk about in his 2013 book. While condemning quantitative geography as an involution which killed the future, according to his own words, Santos helped consolidate a caricature of quantitative geography, which was the object of my study, the study of my PhD thesis. What we realized from the 80s onward was the closing of the black box of quantitative geography. However, unlike the examples of Lacour, where the process of black boxing hides the internal complexity of science to show only its successful results, in the case of the quantitative revolution of Brazilian geography, the process of black boxing turned this into a failure, a scientific and social failure, or maybe even an infamous or nefarious project. Finally, the third aspect that I wanted to highlight here is about the importance of translation of this book to English. This translation allows a new community may get to know this work in another context. Differently from our own context where Santos was heard and has been studied as a powerful and hegemonic voice. The international circulation of this book is associated to a voice coming from the South, an author that sums to the efforts of the decolonization of the discipline. So publishing this book in English contributes to the subversion of knowledge, where ideas are supposedly created in the North to be applied in the South. Bringing for a new generation to a new public and bringing it to new interpretations, the translation expands the geography of this vital book, a geography that starts outside, which is received here in Brazil, which can go abroad again. So I hope that this book, and I hope that this translation may continue crossing my path and the paths of many other women and men who are interested in the practices and the tools of geography, critical geography, which remains being fundamental. So that's it. Thank you very much. Professor, we will continue with Alex Hatz and Kanishka, and then we'll have you. Hello, colleagues. So is translation working? Let me know. Give me some sign. Okay, so we'll have Alex Hatz, then Kanishka, and then we'll have you talking. So welcome. Alex, I think you're muted. Alex, we can't hear you. I'd like to greet everyone who's present here at this event, at this roundtable, especially those who organized this event, and Professor Archie Davies, who's a colleague. And I'd like to greet everyone who's watching. I'm not a geographer by training. I'm an architect, and I'm also an anthropologist. I study Black territory in Brazil, and I also serve as an advisor to research in this area. And I was already reading Dr. Santos when I left architecture to work with geography. And so I got to know academic geography in 1988. And this is a geography that was concerned about social issues. And in the case of my department in Fortaleza, I saw concern regarding indigenous issues and community issues. And this was very important to me because I didn't see any of this in architecture. There was no space, no analysis of space or the communities. None of this was studied in depth. So when Milton Santos writes his book, and this was mentioned by Professor Mariana, when he writes in exile, he comes to Brazil with 4 books that he wanted to present. And he was participating in the AGB Congress in 1978. So his book, it's something that he himself wanted to write, thinking about geographic collectivity, that he was tuned to, in the sense that he knew that these changes and transformations would happen. and that he would also be participating individually. And this is recognized by various historians of geography. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the production and the reception of his book. And I will also talk about a Milton Santos, a Black geographer that we claim in our movement in Brazil. So I'm going to give you guys a testimonial further ahead about this. So he creates this book at the end of his exile period, which lasted for 13 years. And so during these 13 years, he published 7 books, some in French, some of them were translated. He wrote more than 25 articles in different periodicals and journals, mainly for French publications. And he used to say that his exile was a calm period for him. He lived in 7 cities in 7 different countries. While most Brazilian intellectuals lived for the greatest amount of time in France. So he didn't really have much support because he spent basically 2 years in a country and then he'd move to some other city or country. And people say that exile is always a traumatic event. But my understanding of what he went through is a little bit different. Because his high productivity, he was productive in various senses. There was this urgency of understanding the world of the 60s and the 70s, the world during the Cold War, and there were all these cities that were growing a lot in Asia and South America and Africa. We were seeing a lot of growth in third world cities. There was a lot of poverty and underdevelopment. So here we're talking about an urbanization which was not always adequate for the inhabitants of those regions. So when he arrived in Brazil, he had 4 books that he wanted to publish. 3 of them had already been translated, and then there was his new book for new geography. And so he talked about these books in the Congress of Geography in Fortaleza in July of 1978. And that was a milestone of the radical transformation of Brazilian geography, which was marked by traditional geography, of reading of French texts, such as Labache and other authors. And it was also marked by research institutes, basically what we termed quantitative geography. So when Milton arrived, this period was a period of the reorganization of social movements. A lot of people who were exiled were coming back to Brazil, like Milton Nascimento, who even had a new book, which was called The Genocide of the Black Brazilian. So basically, these are intellectuals who were thinking about the country. And meanwhile, the organization, the movement is organizing itself in Brazil. And for the first time, we had Black people in universities in sufficient quantities to form groups. So Milton Santos, for some while, was not a part of these movements. But in the research material that I find, I see invitations to him. There's a course that he administers. There's a course that was supposed to have a talk by Milton Santos, but there's no way of knowing whether that talk actually happened. So I think perhaps you'd have to look at the the material to see whether this happened. But so during a period, people who worked with Milton Santos' thoughts said that he never worked with the racial issue. And this isn't entirely true. He resisted to this idea of being identified as only a Black person. And he didn't want to be an activist of these organizations because he thought that activism limited the intellectual. So this critical geography, which is radical and which has a Marxist base and which has several trends or vertices, today it has been changed. Some people believe this new geography is a hegemonic theory, but I have my doubts about that, because cultural geography is another kind of geography, and some of these geographies still have this reference. But for example, we have the indigenous issue and the former slave colonies. There wasn't a lot of discussion about that. But the most important thing is that Milton Santos thought about this idea of the third world. And this term is no longer used today. Today we talk about the former colonized worlds. Countries of the Central America, Caribbean, South America, and Asia. And there's a very interesting collection of women from the third world. And we have the participation of some important female authors who are Black women and Chicanas. And this is something that you don't find in his book, but which is a part of the set. In an interview, Milton Santos said that he was a third worlder. And so he talked about citizenship. He said that women, these peoples, indigenous people, had mutilated citizenship, incomplete citizenship. And then he talks about the racial issues in interviews that he considered afterwards. And that's why we, in the movement of Black geographies, we claim him as one of our main authors.
So since 1950 to 1970, that's why I think we can call a new geography a Black geography. Let's continue now with Kanishka Goonewardena. Thank you very much.
Okay, so shall I start? No? Okay, great. So first of all, thank you so much for Archie and also my friend and colleague Michelle Buckley from U of T for inviting me to first of all write a review of this great book and find this. So I have to say that I'm here speaking as the non-expert, on Milton Santos. Have read, this book as well as this one, the nature of space and some of his writings that are available in English with great interest. So for me, as Alex said of Milton Santos, I am also a third world. Although I teach, I live in Toronto and teach at the University of Toronto now. I came into political consciousness in Sri Lanka, and I, did my first university degree there in architecture, and before moving on to planning and critical theory and things like that. So so when I picked up this book, I felt an immediate connection, to Milton Santos. So it is almost like, although we are from very different places and parts of the world, I immediately felt this connection as if we were old friends. So so it is, and that kind of the basis for that connection for me is, what Professor Alex Rath said, his third worldism, right? And this I found very interesting, not least because, in contemporary, the academic environment that I operate in, there's a great deal of talk about decolonization and, so on and so forth. But I found Milton Santos to be somehow a little bit different, from the many of the people that I encounter, within the contemporary discourse on decolonization in geography, not only in geography, but various other disciplines as well. So I thought, what could it be, this difference, and for me, it is Milton Santos's, fundamental concern with the, first of all, from his standpoint in Brazil, and also, the part of Brazil that he is from, the problem of, underdevelopment, right? So he's a geographer who's fundamentally concerned with the problems of the project of, development, or let's say development in a socialist direction, for the third world. And this fundamental political and theoretical orientation in the case of Milton Santos also makes him not just a critique of colonialism or in the sense of decolonization, but a very serious student of imperialism, and the continuing forms of imperialism, right? Like, in the old Marxist language, we used to call this, uneven and combined development, right? So this kind of concern is throughout, to be observed, I think, throughout Milton Santos's work. And so this was sort of the most striking impression for me, like, not being an expert on him, but nonetheless, establishing this great connection, from a completely different part of the world to his work, right? So I think, in a way, Santos, because of his fundamental concern with the problems of underdevelopment and the project of development within a theory of imperialism, this makes him a true internationalist, and in my view, like, and also a real radical, cosmopolitan intellectual, right? And this too is, striking for me, because what is called Eurocentric ideology, what Edward Said called Orientalism, and all that kind of stuff. So a popular response to this has been to kind of, in the field of planning, geography, but other disciplines as well, is to kind of basically reject, Europe, and to sort of say that we need knowledge from the non-European parts of the world, from the South, right? So this is a very, important and a real concern and a problem. But I think, again, Milton Santos offers me very unusual and also somewhat like a forgotten way of, dealing with this problem today, so which is not to say like, so for example, he is not somebody who is hesitant to read the leading strands of European theory, right? So he's a avid reader of people like Sartre, Althusser, and all kinds of philosophy, and really engages some of the key concepts, philosophical, theoretical concepts of social formation, concepts of totality, and so on and so forth. But he kind of appropriates them also, from his own, third worldist standpoint in Brazil. And, which is, of course, benefited, enriched, by his many travels and experiences around the world. So there's this really interesting, what I would call an appropriation, of the highest, the greatest resources of European thought, but for a anti-colonial and anti-imperialist political and social project, right? So he provides for me like a model for dealing with, the problems of, Southern theory, the problems of European hegemony, and so on and so forth, which is not to simply like forget and, the sort of the kind of the naive kind of responses to like, I've seen in some places and, syllabus courses and journals even, to kind of, not publish, white men, or, this kind of, thing, but he's not, although he was a black man, Milton Santos was not so stupid, right? To kind of not read Althusser or Sartre or Hegel or somebody like that, but to read them in a way that would be actually beneficial, for people who have suffered, from the uneven and combined development of capitalism in the world, right? So there's a great lot more I can say about this, but I think I have already gone beyond my 5 minutes. So as an intellectual, I think, what I really admire in Santos is his like kind of intellectual openness and innovation and creativity, right? So he uses concepts but kind of, appropriates concepts from various places, but he kind of does his own thing, to come up with some very interesting and often radical, insights into the nature of space and the significance of space for radical politics. So I will stop there and we'll be happy to join the discussion. Yeah.
So I'd just like to thank you, first of all, Archie and Michele as well. Since last year that we're working on this with Milton Santos' energy among us. It's great to be here and see my colleagues, Alex, who's a partner of mine for many years in Brasília, and now a neighbor of mine, Salvador, here spending a little bit of time here. So I was thinking, Archie, about what I wrote and what I could bring here, because Milton Santos used lots of images, but mainly at the end of his careers. And but his writing always brings us great images and sparks our imagination, but I think images help us to have Milton Santos here with us. So I'm just going to open up here a presentation, and I'm going to share it with you. Can you let me know? Are you seeing this? Okay. So here we go. We're going to talk about Milton Santos, who's an Afro-Brazilian man. Why? He's a direct descendant of African roots, but he was born in Brazil. He could have been born in any other part of America, any part of the enslaved parts of America, or that use enslaved workers. But what about Portuguese Afro descendants? They ended up extinguishing these around the 15th century. So an Afro-Colombian or an Afro-Venezuelan have an identity of belonging which has a lot to do with what Milton Santos talks about. I'll talk here about, look, this is a map of the diaspora. So he was born in Chapada Diamantina. He was graduated in law, and he was from the periphery. The centers of cities were like European, but Salvador was completely different. It was totally African. Pierre Verger, the photographer, shows us how much of an Afro-Brazilian city it was. So he was in this part, this wave of Bahian intellectuality, and obviously his work is going to reflect these human beings with a connection to the world, which is different, what they have the right to, what they don't have the right to. And this graph that we can see was Brazil was the country that received the most number of Africans. So it has a special place in terms of slavery industry. This is a school that they had here. They understood the heritage of their African roots in terms of legally, socially, and so on. So it's important that when he was in his youth, or basically Brazil is a slave country. It's a slave republic that was based on slavery in the 19th and 20th century.
So the first census done in Brazil 150 years ago is something that's very important, because this is something that Milton Santos would always face, just like all of us always face, you know, a white society where Black people have no place. So we had 7 different constitutions. Why is this important? Because Milton Santos was a lawyer and he worked with geo rights. So the word territory is present in all of our constitutions. So this is a permanent conflict. The word quilombo, which is a former slave territory, is present in our constitutions. Milton Santos knew about the laws. He knew all about our constitutions, and his work reflects this knowledge almost always. Another important component in his work is the following. We understand that Brazil is myopic. It lives through the secular myopia in the sense that we don't want to see who we are. We don't want to face this slavocratic tendency of trying to erase things. So we try not to look at the diaspora. That's a way of to try to make invisible people who are Black at universities. So people say, oh, you're here, but your place is somewhere else. So this is an old battle. I'm talking about, you know, the university setting because that's where I work in. Milton Santos went through many places, and it serves, and his experience works as backdrop for his book. So he arrived here in 1978, and what happened? So these pillars are important. Brazil doesn't want to look at diaspora. It has a whitening policy that's happening, has been happening for 150 years. It became the most mixed race country. So we have an enormous problem related to inequality. So we're the most unequal country in the world. He supported some politicians from parties such as the Brazilian Communist Party because he knew that these countries needed a place in government. So when he says that the solution is at the periphery, he says that because that's where extermination happens. And so the solution needs to come from those areas. And he also talks about the invisibility of education. So geography is at the service of the state. So we're talking about here the conservative geography. A lot of colleagues here talked about this. So these backdrops, which are very contemporary, were talked about by Milton Santos in his writing. So he didn't create maps, but he described these issues very well in his writings and his citations. So we have two Brazils here. We have a colonial imperial Brazil, where we have rubber plantations, sugar plantations, cattle being raised, gold, diamond, cotton. We have the colonial imperial Brazil. And so the agricultural export that we have today is 500 years old. And then we have a map of the current population. So without doing a lot of spatial analysis, we can see that Brazil froze in time. Brazil still has a very colonial structural space. And that's why Brazil's mentality today, Brazil remains very colonial. And the elections are a reflection of this. The elections materialize this spatial structure. So Brazil is at a crossroads. We have the old Brazil that nobody wants to look at. We have the more African Brazil in all of its components, everywhere in the country. We have this African Brazil who is fighting for visibility and insertion. Look at the Ministry of Ancestral People. We only have a ministry dealing with these people now. So contemporary Brazil, we have a lot of different diasporas. We have diaspora within our own geography. We have the law of return. If I go to Rio de Janeiro or São Paulo, I see a lot of people from the Congo. In Brazil, we have people from Togo. And so, you know, in Brasilia, you have neighborhoods with people from Togo, people who speak their own language. So Brazil hasn't really been able to solve these issues. And today we're an even more complex country. So today we have challenges related to Milton Santos geography, and this is present in many books. So we need to incorporate in our planning processes Milton Santos ideas. So now is the time we need to have reparations, rehabilitation, and then we've got everything. We've got urbanism, geography, urban geography, rural geography. And I just want to give you an example. Let's consider the situation of Columbus. And we have a database that's very strategic for the country. So if I go to the National Institute for the Promotion of Rights, I will find the ordering of the Brazilian territory. I think the country should stop to reflect on how much our society is still prejudiced. But does that explain structural racism? I think a lot of these things can change. I can integrate all of this with what? With what's already available in the state. So I can have, for example, a quilombola CEO. If I get the 6,000 territories of quilombolas, all of them, if all of these territories are productive and we have a seal for that, then the quilombolas will be a part of Brazil's economy. And then quilombolas will be a part of the solution of the country. So there's a whole geography that needs to be incorporated in Brazilian governance. And so all that we need is political opportunity, political space in order to implement these ideas. So the African Brazil that Milton Santos talked about is a Brazil that needs to be seen, needs to be honored, because if it's seen, it's a part of the system. And if it's a part of the system, it becomes part of the law. Some people don't like ancestrality, but we need to have the space. And if we have space, we have territory. And this is very positive. So Milton Santos, in the last 5 years of his life, he wrote something that I really liked regarding action. He says, action is always present. There's no past action, no future action. There's only present action. And action somehow results from choices. So what am I going to do? What direction will I take? Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be here, collaborating in this intelligent conversation. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks for all of these really rich discussions. And I want to start by saying thank you so much to all of you, all of the reviewers, to Rafael and Alex, Mariana, Kanishka, for your really wonderful reviews to the forum that we are going to be published. Your pieces are up online, but they are going to be published in this month's issue as a group. And so this is a really timely time for us to be together. And thank you to Archie too for approaching us with the idea of this forum. But I'm so glad that we're having a panel on this. I'm both an editor, but I'm also here at the University of Toronto, where Milton Santos, as you know, has a particular history. And so I kind of began with that, and I had a look in our library and found I don't know if you can see this in my blurry screen here. It's his 1972 and 73 short series of lectures that he gave when he was a visiting scholar here at the University of Toronto, published. And it has made me wonder very much how much circulation this particular book has had within our own department over the last 30 years. And it's really important. And I'm very honored and pleased to have this on my desk right now. And of course, he was here as a visiting lecturer in 1972 and 73. And it raises a whole host of questions that I think this forum really addresses. Within Dialogues in Human Geography, this forum is really quite exceptional in a number of ways. It's the first time, at least to my knowledge, that we've featured a book that is not new, that is not just coming out, but is in fact, decades old. Although the translation, of course, is new. It's the first time that we featured a book whose author is not here to speak with us. And it's the first time that we have received submissions in languages other than English. And so in many ways, this is a kind of groundbreaking forum. And I want to thank all of the scholars who agreed to put pen to paper on it. As you may know, in Dialogues, for some of the viewers who may not be familiar with the journal, we generally don't ask people to do reviews per se that summarize the book, but we really ask them to think about it in relation to their own work. And what the respondents have done for this forum is quite remarkable, because for the first time also we've had a kind of overview of the book, but we've also kind of had a history of the book and its travels. And more than this, we've had commentaries just as much on the author himself and his life as we have about the book. So together, what I think that gives us is something really more than a regular book forum in so many different ways. For me, one of the really important pieces around this as an editor is to really underline for me the ways in which, and this may not be other journals, of course, but the tendency, I think, to really kind of fetishize the sort of the novel, the newness of sort of new ideas, or what constitutes a new idea means a newly published book. But also that if there are retrospectives on books, it tends to be on books that have already had a real circulation and currency in Anglo-American geography. And usually there's a sort of a revitalized celebration of books that have already perhaps made it into the canon and so on. I think what this does very importantly is to highlight the ways in which Milton Santos's work has been so incredibly important across the world, but has been really subject to these incredible silences within Anglo-American geography. And so what it has raised for me is the need for book forum editing, or at least I will say this from my own perspective, as a relatively new editor, it raises for me the responsibility to dwell in these places of absence and these places of silence, and to think back sort of across space and time around the books that really might be very ripe and important for translation into English, for Anglo-American, those spaces of geography to really contend with books that may not be new and may actually really need to be part of new conversations. So I really want to thank everyone for that. I think it really is definitely unprecedented within dialogues. And so I think that's a really wonderful place for us to be right now. The other thing I'll say too is I think it really, for me, in sort of working in the back ends of things, highlighted the structural and institutional gaps within academic publishing for translation, for all sorts of ways in which it was, logistically less easy to have these conversations. For example, I wanted to say a big muito obrigada, sinto muito to Rafael and Alex and Mariana as I Google translated particular messages terribly. Ooh, yeah, the ways in which there's a real poverty of support for multilingual conversations was really something that was very underlined for me, of resources for translation. The fact that our manuscripts portal is only available in English. I think these are things that particularly well-resourced publishers that lie behind paywalls, which many institutions across the world cannot access. We have, these are not new points, obviously, these have been made many times, but for me, I think this is another major issue and set of major opportunities, I think, that forums like this really open up. So, and just finally, I'll say, I'm also, with my faculty hat on, I'm also teaching the core course of the PhDs in geography this year, which has been a wonderful opportunity. And this forum really, for me, raises new questions about, whose interpretations of geography's histories and historiography really need to be within what we introduce to students. And so Milton Santos has been on the syllabus this year at the University of Toronto. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Muito obrigado a todos. I will, that was just a wonderful set of reflections, which I think does honor to the extraordinary diversity and power of Milton Santos's thought. I wanted to now open to the question and answer. I will take my privilege of asking one question to our panelists, which can encourage you to reflect on other things that you've heard that you want to respond to. And I would encourage you to be I'm a very time-focused chair. So to be as brief as you can in answering this question, but if you want to also comment on others. But what I wanted to, and this picks up on, I think, something that all of you have said in different ways, which is, who should we read Milton Santos with? Who is also in that absence that Michelle was talking about? Who is also in that? I mean, obviously, I have my ideas about this, but in the genealogy that Alex or that Rafael was referring to about histories of Afro-Brazilian thought, of Black thought, but also the kind of third worldist context and international cosmopolitan context that you put him in, Kanishka. So you can be as brief as you like, but who should we now be retrospectively constructing those conversations with Milton Santos? And please start posting your questions in the chat while they respond. We can begin from the beginning. So Mariana, if you want to.
All right. I'm just wondering about women that are always absent in this kind of discussion. I believe that we have to find them in the archives and what they wrote and what they construct. And probably also the Northeast geographers, who they have many problems in publishing and get their work known in different contexts, because we have here, of course, this kind of reference in the Southeast, and we miss a lot of Northeast thinking and intellectual work. This is it.
Alex.
Bom, eu também vou nesse sentido de, né, ler Milton Santos. Não.
I'm thinking of other people from the same period. There's Urbana, who there's lots. I'm also thinking about sort of Black activists as well, who could. I think he's frozen. He has for me anyway. I'm not sure if Alex has got a problem with his. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Archie, for the question.
Thank you for the.
So I actually, when I think I mentioned this in my review, when I was reading this book, I had just finished reading another work on the political economy of underdevelopment by a Sri Lankan political economist named S.B.D. De Silva, and another Sri Lankan writer who also has this Portuguese last name, G.V.S. De Silva, and this is a book called Socialism or Barbarism, published in the 70s. And so I, in my head, I can't read Santos, without reference to, these kinds of, writers, dealing with problems of imperialism, underdevelopment, and that kind of stuff. But I think we should also read Santos with reference to the most radical and powerful European theory and philosophy. So people like Sartre, and Althusser, and so on. And of course, Lefebvre, Andre Lefebvre. So Santos's sources are quite varied. But he kind of. So I think he's not like a third. I mean, he's a third world thinker, of course, but he's kind of one who also critically appropriates the best of European thought, right? And so one has to read him with some of that literature, but also, other third world writers, so we can include from the African continent, people like, Amilcar Cabral and, and so on. And then from the Caribbean, Walter Rodney and so people of that kind of, anti-colonial third worldist tradition. I think essential points of reference. Finally, I would also suggest maybe this could be too provocative, but we can also read him against some people. You ask like, who should we read him with? So I would say, against some of the contemporary fashions of decolonial theory. So I would put him against like somebody like Walter Bignolo, for example. So yeah.
When Archie put his question, with some of my my colleagues have already anticipated what I was going to say, but I had another idea. How about we teach Milton Santos in primary school? Imagine public state school, in Mangueira, the neighborhood in Rio, in Rio de Janeiro. Morro do Gantuá, another neighborhood in Salvador, or the Iracema Beach in Fortaleza, in the northeast. The teacher goes in, let's talk about geographical spaces. Ooh, let's talk about territories. How would it be to take him into schools? And the feeling of belonging, how would it, how would it be to talk to 6, 7-year-old children about this? And in the way that this is planted, this will stay with them for the whole of their lives. Because the same happened with me with teachers and who I think about still today. So this challenge is which is the basis, with geography is the basis of everything. And so we're not talking about him being involved in governing and ordering territories, but obviously his work reflects that. But at the same time, he went to a state school. He was taught at home as well. So he obviously got a head start with parents who were teachers, but he took it very well. So I'm thinking about this challenge of elementary school, where, because geography isn't a compulsory subject in secondary education, but it is in primary. So that's what I would say at the moment. So I said it's important to read him. And his other books that he wrote, where he talks about ethnic cities marked in Africa, in India, and Brazil. He already, and who studied this was José Teixeira. and we're discussing that Milton also talked a lot or engaged a lot with people from Venezuela, from Africa. So who are the third world references of his? That's important for us to look at. So as I say, from Tanzania, from Venezuela, I think that's important. He also read, and I don't think people understand how much he read of from geographers from Africa and from Latin America.
Do we want to keep moving on to another question? Because I'm happy to see the space for that.
Yeah, why don't we do that? So I think that there are two, thank you, Michelle, keep helping me keep on track. So I think that there are some really lovely comments from Lucia and Monica and about translation, but I don't think there are direct questions. So I would take two questions from the Q&A and offer panelists can respond to whichever they would like. The first is about the kind of contestation over the term territory. I think we've touched on that to some extent, but I think we could continue to pick it up. And secondly, the connections or lack of connections between Santos and the Lusophone world. I think what I'll do now is open it to whoever would like to take either of those questions. I can say one thing on the question about the Lusophone world, which is a limited part of the response. But I think it's interesting that he was in Dar es Salaam at this moment of a kind of coagulation, coming together of radical thinkers, including Walter Rodney, but also some very interesting connections with Anglophone political ecology, Ben Wissner, an interesting figure in political ecology in that period. But also that Dar es Salaam was in many ways a kind of hub for Mozambique, the independence movements in Mozambique as well. That I think is very deeply layered inside his theorizing and his writing rather than explicit. But clearly he's conscious of that crucial moment around in the early 1970s of Lusophone African independences. Clearly he's engaged in that world in Dar es Salaam. But he doesn't cite Cabral, or as far as I'm aware. Would anyone like to intervene on the question of territory? And we've, as I said, we've raised it, but I think there's much more to say.
Bom, não sei bem, né, quem perguntou que.
I'm not sure who asked the question and what it was specifically, but thinking of new geography and new debates from the 70s about space was a huge achievement, because historians, sociologists, architects had talked about space before. So in Brazil, this idea of territory needs to be used very carefully. We talk about indigenous territories, quilombola territories, territories of battles over sexuality or sex, but we think about it in phenomena of conflict and groups. But the second of Lula's government had a category of territory in terms of serving these areas, talk about Quilombola territories and citizen territories. So it's kind of a continuity of this use of the word, but sometimes there's no consensus about how to use it.
Some people have a cultural perspective on this, but we're still able to identify the lineages and adopt this line of thinking. Okay, I have a question, which is directly related to the translation, to this new old book. And this ends up showing up in a very distinct context. And Michelle talked about this when she talks about how she adopted this book. And I think about how interesting it would be to know how this reading will take place in a classroom or in a graduate program. As a critical review of the different disciplines that we're thinking, this is what Milton Santos tries to do. So I'd like to know from you, Michelle and Archie, how are you thinking about reading this text in the Anglo-American context? How will you adapt, or how will you fit this work into that context? And Archie, I have a very specific question for you, because for me, this invitation was really great because I did a lot of rereading of this book, and I crossed this book crossed my path many times. And its style, the style of this book really called my attention, how elegantly it's written. It's a very elegant book. And you can see very clearly the influence of philosophy and how he delves deeply into philosophy and other fields. And I can imagine how difficult it must be to translate this kind of writing. So sometimes, the style of writing is sublimated by the simplicity of certain languages, such as English. So, Archie, I'd like to know from you, how important was it to know his work and to know the person, Milton Santos, and how important it was to understand his trajectory, so that you could, overcome the barriers of language and really translate the style, which is very characteristic of him.
Maybe I can start with that, Michelle, and maybe you could take the original question. I think I think he's an extremely beautiful writer. I think he writes very beautiful sentences. The beauty of those sentences is not easy to translate into English, because in particular the kind of Baroque style of elegant academic Portuguese for me, doesn't translate well as it in a Baroque way into English. For me, a kind of and this is very subjective, and this is the nature of translation, but my maneuver was always to turn this elegant Baroque formulations into a lucid and direct language in English. That was my intention, which led me to work to move his language quite far. And one of the things that I found very interesting is starting to talk about the book in English with Anglophone colleagues who now know it in English. And they obviously attend closely to the language. And I immediately go, what have I done? What did he write? What have I done? Where is this come from? But I think that what that makes me realize is the book, and this is not deliberate necessarily, but the book is now in my language, that it's a book that I wrote. And I think that's a very complicated position to adopt, particularly in relation to the kinds of intellectual histories that Alex and Rafael have been talking about, and own position coming to kind of Afro-Brazilian intellectual history, and that's a complicated position, but it's one that, as a translator, you have to accept that the kind of I don't want to use the word violence. I don't think that's the right word, but the depth of what you do to the original. And so I have always preferred to try to speak exactly to the elegance that you talk about in the original by making it elegant and readable in English. That was what I was trying to do, rather than being obsessed with following every element of his line of thought inside the sentences, because that isn't possible in English. So I've tried to make that explicit in the introduction as well, to write about how I've translated it. And it's something that I'm still thinking about a lot, about the politics of that practice as a translator. Yeah, but thank you for the question. Michelle.
Sure. Thank you for that, Archie. And Mariana, thank you. Brigada, thank you for that very much. I really appreciate this question, and I love it because I think it gets into the places where I feel most uncomfortable and worried about what it is that I'm doing. And so I think it's a really important question to ask. So I think, at least, and it was something that I really deliberated on, about whether or not to put a piece by Santos or on the syllabus, in part because I'm not a teacher of Santos's work, and I actually can't. And so part of what I think I'm learning as a teacher is when to make really clear, especially for students who are in a core course. So it's a really broad overview of geography. When I'm reading a text with students where I can actually take on the role of an instructor, and when I'm reading a text with the students as a student. And that does not absolve me of any responsibility necessarily. I really don't think it does, but I do think it helps to, for me at least, acknowledge to the students that I may not be able to make sense that I need to, as an instructor, to really be able to teach something like that properly, because I don't think I can. So it usually comes with a caveat like that. And I was not going to put it on the core course curriculum, except that when I looked at sort of histories of the quantitative revolution, some of those histories, otherwise the syllabus would actually be mostly histories rooted in the United States, in the English language, and in the UK, and that seemed insufficient. And part of the objective of the course was not to give students a really in-depth understanding of all the materials, but actually to ensure that they know that there are multiple conversations going on that they will be able to dive into. So that's sort of where I was coming from. But I think your question makes me also consider too the ways in which, the inherent power dynamics of even this particular panel, where Alex and Rafael and many people's work was translated into English and doesn't get to exist in its original formulation, and the total issues around that, but also my responsibility as a scholar to work in other languages, right? And so I'm trying to learn other languages right now, but I think that's the other piece of this as well that comes from your question. I don't know if that answers it much, but thank you. Mm-hmm.
Unless anyone would like to add there are a couple more questions in the chat, and maybe we could take, I could do the same thing and put them out. The first is around podemos pensar Milton Santos como intérprete do Brasil, as an interpreter of the Brazilian reality. The first thing I would do would be to guide you all, in particular to Rafael's contribution to the forum, which really turns on that question of Milton Santos and the interpretation of Brazil, but he could maybe contribute to that now. And then the questions from Alexandra around how he's being taught today, and how do people read him in Brazil today, which I think is a really important question. And Mariana can maybe speak to that, and questions around translation. But again, I'll open the floor if people would like to contribute along either of those lines. I think this will be our last contribution. So if you also want to conclude by saying anything, then maybe this would be the time as well. Muito obrigado. Kanishka, do you want to begin?
Well, I'd like to first of all talk about my perspective, which is also interesting. So I come from Rio de Janeiro, and in Rio, at universities in Rio, you know, I joined the university in the 90s, and basically we read less of Milton Santos than the students in São Paulo. So that's something that's very clear to me. So the adoption of his books, the adoption of Milton Santos in the classroom, at least in my program, this wasn't as evident as what we see in other places. So this is something that we went after because we really wanted to read his work. This was very important to us. And his material was in all of the tests for graduate programs. So at some moment in time, you would have to do with his material. And I did this some research some time ago. And basically one of his books was a part of all bibliographies for you to go into graduate program. And this book of his is a very difficult book. It was a very sophisticated book. And basically nobody graduated reading that book. So I remember that I shared, so we wanted to read The Nature of Space together because we could not do this by ourselves because it was such a complicated book. So we needed to have a reading session in order to work with Milton Santos material. Currently, I think that we have this eruption of Black geography and feminist geography and the colonial geography. And so the new generation is rediscovering Milton Santos material. His book is very important in urban geography, but I've been observing that discussions that are tangential to issues that deal with exploited groups, this is something that has been happening. So I teach two disciplines, story of geographic thinking and cultural geography. And I use Milton Santos' work in both of my classes. And I can never abandon his material because the discussion that we do in these two topics, they involve discussing what's in this book. So I think it's important to present students this critical revision. And I work at a university that has a lot of Black students. So it's important for us to have Black literature. And that's why we've been raising this discussion. So that's why I believe Milton Santos is being more widely read today. Eu gostaria que todo mundo desse suas últimas palavras. Então, primeiro, eu gostaria de dar a palavra a Kanishka, professor Kanishka.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be brief. So Alexandra raises of the 4 questions. I would like to look at the third one. Does it matter that Anglophone audiences might not be familiar with the context in which Santos's work was produced? Can they still use it meaningfully? So, well, this is a kind of a question that we have to deal with lots of writers. So whether we read Gramsci or Althusser or Lefebvre, so we need some idea, but the European context is perhaps a little bit better known, so it's easier, but so my short answer to this is, of course, I hope it is possible to, for North American audiences to kind of do a little bit of work, in order to understand, what that, third world is, tricontinental movement, the conjuncture, was about, and how Santos was a, pretty much a product of that, but not just like an ordinary product, but a very like a innovative one, so the context, I think, is key. to understanding him, but that does not mean that he can have a relevance beyond that context. So people, I mean, theory travels, as Edward Said and others have kind of talked about. So sometimes in a new context, people will see different things. So that's okay too. And but the last thing I want to add, I mean, I raised my hand because I don't want to have the last word in this great conversation, so I wanted to go first, so so the one thing is that, it's also important not to kind of think of Santos only as a Brazilian, only, with respect to his identity, because at the end of the day, for me, like, he's a philosopher and a theorist, like a theoretician of space and so on, that who must be considered equal to like Lefebvre or Harvey or anybody like else, so one has to kind of foreground the theoretical and intellectual contribution to geography, which I mean, it always comes from a place and a location, but if we consider, like, focus too much on the location, on the space and the background, we may lose the actual intellectual innovation, and critical, theoretical and philosophical contribution, that is on par with any great intellectual. And this is why I think Santos, in my view, belongs, is not only a Brazilian, but like a, man of the world, let's say, like a person of the world, yeah.
Two quick words then. I put here in the chat a program called Thinking Africanly, and he was one of the thinkers of this. It brings some references that are important from Africa to Brazil. I put a link in the chat, and we're talking about a moment. It's completely relevant to this moment here. All the political situation in Brazil, deforestation is alive. He is alive. Milton Santos. He's gone beyond his own time, and that gap that Mariana talked about very well. It's a continental country with lots of geographies, with lots of aspects. So, Alex, I know that you're more systematic and so on. It's interesting how Milton Santos is present in Brazilian geography now. It's not just an impression by someone. Why is this the case? Thinking about Salvador, the city, or I think it was this year, it named one of its avenues Milton Santos. How many Bahians know him? He's not in schools, Milton Santos, but he's in the city now. So it's something for us to reflect on, as in being a man of the world, a citizen of the world, how he's still is also sort of helping his country where he was born, by Brazil, Salvador, Bahia, and the Chapada Diamantina, which is where he was born, which also has a road which has got his name. How many people know who he is? So he's around. He can hear us. And thinking what we can do for him, not just to be read, but to be seen and understood and respected, that, when he needs to be. And that's it. Thank you once again for the opportunity to be here. And my purpose is to serve, so and contribute. So there you go. just to finish off here, then I've seen lots of his speeches and talks and reports which talks a lot about the racial issue and then health. And we talked once about affirmative actions. So he was close to the Black movement, but he didn't see himself as a militant, but as an intellectual. But he thought that these relationships were important. And so it's important that there's new, young Black people wanting to read Milton Santos now and so on. So it was a very fertile period when he wrote this book. So, and it was been a very fertile moment now. So I'd just like to thank you for this opportunity.
Michelle, would you like to have a last thought from your perspective before we let everybody go into the afternoon or the night, wherever they are?
Sorry, Archie, you just cut out there. I couldn't hear us. You just froze. Sorry. Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't hear that. I would just like to thank the review editor, or the commentators in the forum. I'd like to thank you, Archie, for organizing everything and for the really wonderful comments and questions from everyone. I think this has been a really beautiful capstone to the forum that's going to be published shortly. And thank you on behalf of Dialogues to everyone.
Thank you so much. I would just like to thank all these wonderful scholars who have been so generous with their time. It's a real honor to be in conversation with you all, and I've learned so much from that process. So, muito obrigado. And I would just say in closing to all the attendees to read their commentaries. I think they're wonderful reflections. And there's so much depth in putting them into conversation, into dialogue with one another and with Milton Santos. So Milton Santos vive, as Rafael said, and muito obrigado, and thank you again to everybody for coming. And thank you so much to the interpreters as well for your work.